What if I told you that London in 1920 was a city balancing between deep grief and wild celebration? Welcome to Tube Euro Retro, a place where we revisit powerful moments from Europe's past. My name is Michael James, and today I invite you to walk with me through a fascinating year when London was changing faster than ever. Before we begin, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this video if you find it meaningful. Some visuals you will see are symbolic images created to help illustrate the story, so they may not always perfectly match the events described. I hope you will understand and enjoy the journey. Now sit back, relax, and let's step together into the unforgettable London of 1920. In 1920, London stood at the threshold of a new decade, shaped by both grief and restless energy. Only a short time had passed since the end of the First World War, a conflict that had taken millions of lives across Europe and beyond. The city was also recovering from the devastating influenza pandemic that swept the world at the end of the war. For many Londoners, daily life still carried the memory of loss, empty seats at family tables, and neighborhoods that had sent an entire generation of young men to the front. Yet something remarkable was beginning to change. As the decade opened, the mood of the city slowly shifted from mourning toward movement, curiosity, and a desire to live fully again. Historians often describe this moment as the beginning of the Roaring Twenties, a period when music, fashion, and nightlife began to reshape urban life across the Western world. London was no exception. If you had walked through the West End during those months, you would have noticed a new rhythm in the streets. Theatres filled with audiences eager for laughter and spectacle. Restaurants and dance halls stayed open late into the evening. Jazz music, arriving from across the Atlantic, began to influence the sound of the city. After years defined by war and illness, many people simply wanted to gather, celebrate, and feel that life was moving forward again. In many ways, 1920 marked the moment when London began to rediscover its voice. Around 1920, a new and very visible social change began to appear in the streets and dance halls of London. Young women were stepping into public life with a confidence that had rarely been seen before. Many of them became known as flappers. The term described a generation that embraced modern fashion, music, and independence in ways that challenged older expectations. If you could watch the crowds moving through London at the time, you would quickly notice the difference. Many young women cut their hair short into neat bobs instead of wearing the long styles that had been common before the war. Their skirts became shorter and more practical, allowing them to move freely through crowded dance floors and busy city streets. In nightclubs and social gatherings, they danced to new rhythms such as the Charleston, a style that symbolized the spirit of the new decade. But this cultural shift was not only about fashion or music, it also reflected a deeper frustration with social limits placed on young women. In 1918, Britain had granted voting rights to women over the age of 30. However, younger women who had worked in factories, hospitals, and offices during the war were still excluded from the vote. Many felt that their contributions to society had not been fully recognized. For this generation, the flapper lifestyle became a quiet but visible form of protest. Through their appearance, their social lives, and their confidence in public spaces, they signaled that the old rules were beginning to change. In many ways, these young women helped shape the modern culture that would define the decade ahead. By 1920, London's nightlife had begun to transform in ways that fascinated and sometimes shocked the public. After years of wartime restrictions, many people were eager to experience freedom again, and the city responded with a wave of new nightclubs and late evening gatherings. The West End became one of the liveliest areas in the city, where music, dancing, and conversation carried on long after midnight. Among the most talked about venues was the Cave of the Golden Calf. This nightclub had already gained a reputation before the war for its modern atmosphere and artistic crowd, and it continued to influence London's nightlife culture. Another famous figure of the era was Kate Myrick, widely known in the press as Mama Myrick. She operated several clubs, including the well-known Club 43 Inches Soho, which attracted actors, musicians, journalists, and curious members of high society. These venues became gathering places for a group that newspapers later called the Bright Young People. They were young aristocrats, artists, writers, and socialites who enjoyed experimenting with new styles of entertainment. Many hosted elaborate costume parties and unusual social events that quickly became stories for the tabloid press. Journalists eagerly followed their activities, publishing photographs and detailed descriptions of their gatherings. The excitement around this group sometimes extended beyond the dance floor. Some members of this fashionable circle were known for driving expensive cars through London late at night, including powerful Bugatti sports cars that symbolized wealth and modern technology. For many observers, these scenes represented a new kind of youth culture emerging in the capital. In the early 1920s, London nightlife became not only a form of entertainment, but also a stage where a new generation displayed its confidence and its desire to shape modern society. While London's nightlife in 1920 often appeared glamorous and exciting, there was also a more complicated reality behind the bright lights of the clubs. As new venues opened and crowds gathered late into the night, authorities and journalists began to notice social problems that were emerging within this rapidly growing nightlife culture. At that time, the legal situation surrounding certain substances was very different from what many people today might expect. Before the Dangerous Drugs Act was passed in 1920, drugs such as morphine and cocaine could still be legally obtained in some medical preparations. They were used by doctors for pain treatment and sometimes included in medicines that were sold through pharmacies. During the First World War, these substances had also been used in hospitals to treat wounded soldiers. When the war ended, thousands of veterans returned to Britain carrying both physical injuries and psychological trauma. Some had been exposed to these substances during medical treatment, and a number of them struggled with dependence after returning to civilian life. This issue slowly became visible in parts of London's social scene. Within certain late-night venues, reports began to appear about drugs circulating among guests. Some newspapers even referred to particular places as cocaine parlours, reflecting the growing concern among the public and government officials. These concerns eventually led to stronger regulation. The Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920 introduced stricter controls over the distribution of substances such as morphine and cocaine across Britain. Now, I would really love to hear your thoughts about this moment in history. Do you think this part of London's nightlife story is interesting or surprising? Do you feel this information is useful or something you had never heard before? Please share your opinion in the comments, because your perspective always makes these historical discussions more meaningful. Personally, I find this topic fascinating, and I would truly enjoy hearing what you think about it. And if you enjoy exploring little-known moments of history like this, you might consider subscribing to the channel Tube Euro Retro so you do not miss the next stories we uncover together. In early 1920, London was not only a city of theatres, nightclubs, and social change, it was also one of the most important political centres in the world. Inside government buildings and diplomatic offices, decisions were being made that would shape the future of entire regions far beyond Britain. From February to April of that year, leaders from Britain, France, and Italy gathered in the British capital for what became known as the London Conference. These meetings focused largely on the fate of the Ottoman Empire, which had collapsed after the First World War. For centuries, the Ottoman state had controlled vast territories across the Middle East and parts of southeastern Europe. Now, the victorious Allied powers were debating how those lands would be reorganized. The discussions were complex and often controversial. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George and other Allied leaders examined how new political boundaries might be drawn and which powers would influence the emerging states. Questions surrounding the authority of the Ottoman Sultan and the future of the Caliphate were also part of these negotiations. The goal was to reshape the region while maintaining the broader peace settlements that followed the war. These diplomatic talks helped pave the way for the Treaty of Sèvres later in 1920. That treaty attempted to formally divide much of the former Ottoman territory among Allied interests and new political administrations. Looking back today, historians often view these decisions as a major moment in the redrawing of the Middle East. And for a short but critical period in 1920, many of those decisions were being debated in meeting rooms right in the heart of London. In 1920, the struggle for Irish independence was no longer confined to Ireland. It had reached the very heart of London. One of the most powerful moments of that struggle involved Terence MacSwiney, the Lord Mayor of Cork and a leading member of the Irish Republican movement. MacSwiney was arrested by British authorities in August 1920 on charges related to sedition. Instead of being tried in Ireland, he was brought to Brixton prison in London. From the moment he was imprisoned, he chose a form of protest that would capture global attention. MacSwiney began a hunger strike, refusing food as a statement against British rule in Ireland. Days turned into weeks, and his condition slowly worsened. Newspapers across Britain, Europe, and the United States reported on his declining health. Supporters gathered outside the prison, while political leaders around the world followed the story closely. The hunger strike lasted an extraordinary 74 days. On the 25th of October 1920, Terence MacSwiney died in Brixton prison. His death sent shockwaves through international public opinion. For many observers, the event symbolized the intensity of Ireland's struggle for independence and the human cost behind it. The impact of his sacrifice extended far beyond Britain and Ireland. His protest influenced later movements that used hunger strikes and non-violent resistance as political tools. Leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi later spoke about the power of moral resistance, and historians note that MacSwiney's example was known to many activists around the world, including future revolutionary figures such as Ho Chi Minh. In this way, a protest that began inside a London prison cell became part of a much larger global story. By the summer of 1920, another powerful challenge was shaping life in London and across Britain. The brief economic optimism that followed the end of the First World War began to fade. During the war, factories and industries had expanded rapidly to support military production. But when peace arrived, demand dropped sharply. Many factories reduced operations, and workers who had once been urgently needed suddenly found themselves without jobs. The impact was serious and visible across the country. By the end of 1920, more than 500,000 people in Britain were unemployed. In London and other major cities, this created deep anxiety for working families who depended on steady wages. Long lines formed outside labour offices as men searched for any available work. The contrast with the lively nightlife and cultural changes of the same period could not have been more striking. Out of this crisis, new forms of political activism began to emerge. One important organisation was the National Unemployed Workers Movement, often called the NUWM. It was created to defend the rights of unemployed workers and to pressure the government to address the growing hardship. Demonstrations and organised protests became more common as people demanded solutions. The British government also responded to the rising tension. In October 1920, Parliament passed the Emergency Powers Act. This law allowed authorities to take special measures during national emergencies, especially if strikes or unrest threatened essential services. Now, I would really love to hear your thoughts about this moment in history. Do you think this story is interesting or useful to understand London after the war? Is this something you had heard about before? Please share your opinion in the comments, because your perspective makes these historical conversations much richer. Personally, I find this part of history very fascinating. Let's share our ideas and perspectives together. And if you enjoy exploring lesser-known historical stories like this, you might consider subscribing to the channel Tube Euro Retro, so you can join us for many more journeys into the past. On the 11th of November 1920, London witnessed one of the most emotional public ceremonies in its modern history. 2 years had passed since the end of the First World War, yet the grief of the conflict was still deeply present in the lives of millions of families across Britain. Nearly every town and village had lost sons, fathers, brothers, and friends. Many of them had been buried far from home on battlefields across Europe. On that day, a national moment of remembrance unfolded in the heart of the capital. In Whitehall, King George V unveiled the permanent Cenotaph, a solemn stone monument designed by the architect Sir Edwin Lutyens. The structure was intentionally simple and unadorned. It represented an empty tomb, a symbolic place where the nation could mourn those whose bodies never returned home. At the same time, another powerful ceremony took place nearby. The body of an unidentified British soldier, known as the Unknown Warrior, was brought from a battlefield in France to London. The coffin was carried through streets lined with silent crowds before being laid to rest in Westminster Abbey. For many people watching that procession, the Unknown Warrior represented every missing soldier whose grave was unknown. The ceremony offered a place for collective mourning and reflection. From that moment onward, both the Cenotaph and the tomb in Westminster Abbey became enduring national symbols of remembrance, honouring the countless lives lost during the war. As 1920 drew toward its end, London revealed a striking mixture of progress and quiet transformation. The city was moving into a modern age, yet signs of an older world slowly fading could still be seen across its streets and neighbourhoods. One symbol of the future appeared south of the city with the growing importance of Croydon Airport. In the early 1920s, it became Britain's main international airport and one of the first major aviation hubs in Europe. At a time when air travel was still new and exciting, Croydon connected London to cities across the continent. For many people, the sight of aircraft arriving and departing represented the beginning of a new era of global movement. At the same time, everyday life inside the city was becoming more modern. London introduced some of its first regular night bus services, allowing people to travel across the capital long after the evening trains had stopped running. This small change reflected the growing energy of urban life, as theatres, restaurants and clubs stayed active late into the night. Yet while new systems were appearing, parts of the old aristocratic London were quietly disappearing. Several grand townhouses that had once belonged to powerful noble families were demolished during this period. Maintaining these vast residences had become increasingly difficult after the war. Their disappearance marked a subtle but important shift, showing that the social structure of pre-war Britain was slowly giving way to a different kind of society. As we look back at London in 1920, we see a city standing at a remarkable turning point in history. The capital was still carrying the scars of the First World War, yet it was also stepping into a new and modern age. The same streets that hosted theatres, music, and lively nightclubs were also the places where political decisions and economic struggles shaped the future. That contrast is what makes this moment in history so fascinating to me. Personally, I find this period incredibly powerful because it shows how societies can experience grief, hope, and change at the same time. To help bring these historical moments to life, some of the visuals in this video were created with artificial intelligence, so the scenes could feel more vivid and easier to imagine while we explore the real history together. I would truly love to hear your thoughts. Do these events from London in 1920 surprise you or make you see that era differently? Please share your perspective in the comments so we can discuss it together. If you enjoyed this journey into history, remember to like the video, share it with others who love history, and subscribe to Tube Euro Retro so we can keep discovering the past together.